Thank you. Thank you so very much. It is so much fun for me to be back at Liberty. You all enjoy it as much as I do when I'm here. If I could go to college any place in the world, I'd go to Liberty. I tell you, every place I go, I run into people who've been here. And just like with Donald Trump, if you come to this place, and it's not the buildings, we love the buildings and nice new buildings, nicer than most colleges, but it's the student body that makes you remember and to get to be with you, and you know where you're going and what you're doing. And I need to quit talking about you because I got something I need to say in about 20 minutes, because this country is at a very unique place, and you hold the key to where it goes. It was the summer of 1776. 56 men met in Philadelphia. They'd talked about something for a long time. They decided this is our chance. They decided to declare independence. About 20,000 young men joined up to fight for that independence. They thought, well, we'll be able to do this. Our friends and neighbors will help us. And there in New York, under the command of George Washington, they woke up one morning and there were 400 ships surrounding Long Island Sound and Manhattan and up and down the Hudson. And they said, what are we going to do now? And so the British began to attack, and they began to lose, and they lost, and they lost, and they lost. They had them back up there at the end of Brooklyn and to get across the river, and the British said, well, let's don't attack tonight. We'll get them in the morning. And George Washington says Providence intervened, and a heavy cloud settled down upon, and all night long they went across the Hudson. It stayed until over 10 o'clock in the morning the following day. And as the last soldiers began to make it across to the river, the cloud began to lift, and they were then chased by the British across New Jersey and ended up in the winter of 1776 at Valley Forge, where it had dwindled to 7,500 troops from 20,000. Only 2,400 could even stand up to march. They were so ill. They only hung on because on January 1st their enlistment was up. If they could just make it till then, they might get paid. And George Washington knew that unless a leader did something, this whole idea would come to an end. And so he got his groups together, the best ones that could walk and move. They didn't have good uniforms. In fact, their boots weren't so good. They took burlap and wrapped them around their feet. And as they began to march, you could see the blood in the snow. You could follow the troops. So they decided to go down to Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas Day to attack the British contingency there under the Hessians and to have an effort to have victory. For he knew, and the password that he gave to the soldiers was victory or death. That is, this whole idea of America will come to an end. Well, what happened is they went in and they attacked. The weather was so bad that some of the sentries had pulled in because they said no one could even walk under these conditions. But they made it across the Delaware River, the picture that you've seen so often. They attacked and actually captured over 1,200 soldiers, but more than that, they captured armaments and food and supplies and all the things that they needed. One of the 6 people that were wounded, a casualty, was James Monroe, who got hit in the shoulder and fortunately hit an artery because it began to spurt, and people began to notice it right away, and they clamped it so that he could then survive to be the 5th president of the United States, fighting beside James Madison, who 11 years later would be known Monroe was 18, Madison was 20. 11 years later, he would become the father of the Constitution. He was fighting next to Alexander Hamilton, age 21, who then a few years later would establish the banking system for America that would make the U.S. dollar the foundation for the entire currencies of all the rest of the world. John Marshall, age 22, would become the finest Chief Justice of the nation. All of them fighting that night. People just like you that had a dream, had a commitment, had principle, and changed the world and made this not only the lighthouse for the gospel that the world looks to for hope and righteousness, but made it the most powerful nation on earth. The question would be, how do you judge greatness in a nation? Well, there's a check mark, 4 points: economic, military, political, and leadership. Let's quickly walk through them. Economic. This nation created more wealth in 200 years than all previous history of mankind. In 2008, we decided to vote for change. And one of the first things we did was look at the spending patterns. And the United States had carried a debt rate. If you go in to borrow money for a car or for a house. They want to say, what are your financials? That is, how much do you owe and how much do you make? And the national debt for America between the last 70 years, from World War II till now, was virtually a straight line. It fluctuated between 35 and 45% of the gross domestic product all the way across until the day that Barack Obama was sworn into president. And on January of 2009, it was at 40% of GDP, virtually exactly the place where it had been forever, except he had a good idea, he thought. That is, why don't we just go spend a whole potload of money? And so he came up with this idea, and he called it a stimulus program. Stimulus. Now, that stimulus means that it's not going for agriculture or for education or for defense or for anything else. This is Chicago walking around money. We're just going to get some money, and we're going to pass it out. And he passed a bill that was nearly $1 trillion. We've never done that in history. Nearly $1 trillion. Now, money doesn't mean anything except in comparison. All the money that's sent to Washington, the entire tax revenue of the entire nation is $2.5 trillion. And he came in the first 10 days, wanted to pass another $1 trillion in spending. Now, the national debt was already, deficit that year was going to be about 400. He added another $1 trillion on top of that and spent 200 more and ran the deficit that year to $1.6 trillion in 1 year. And then he went around and said, I inherited it. Inherited it, nothing. You're the one running the credit card. But what did that do to the nation? Well, over the last 4 years, the income to the average family has diminished by 10%. But the net worth, the value of all of us, when we take the value of our home, the value of our car, when we put all our balance sheets together, 40% of the wealth of the nation has been diminished in just these last 4 years. In fact, the wealth of the nation has now gone back to 1990. In other words, 22 years of progress has been wiped out because of the spending patterns of Washington. You say, well, why do they do this? Good question. Glad you asked that, because I got the answer. The way that it works is you have to create wealth. And government cannot create wealth. Government only takes from people that have it. I used an example once before. Let me just quickly do it again. That is that if a person pulls up in a car and someone comes over and takes half of the money out of the person's purse while she's sitting there at the streetlight, has that person created any wealth? No, it hasn't created. Has he redistributed wealth? Yes, redistributed. But he didn't create any wealth. It takes wealth to create a job. So a criminal coming along taking money out of the purse cannot, by definition, cannot create a job because they haven't created any wealth. All they've done is redistribute it. So instead of calling that person a criminal, let's call him a congressman. And he comes along and he takes half of the money. And when he takes half of the money out, has he redistributed wealth? Yes. Has he created any wealth? No. So therefore, can a politician create a job? Of course not. Of course not. Because you have to create something. How do you create it? You have to build it. You have to invest and make something that somebody else wants so that they take their money and they engage in purchasing the product, and both are then better off when they do it. In order to do that in America, it takes about $250,000 per job. That's the average. It works like this. Let us suppose you lived on a farm. On a farm, what you would do is you would take money at the end, take grain at the end of the year, and you would put it aside, and this grain will be called seed corn. That is, we're not going to eat it, and we're not going to sell it. We're going to save it for next year. And next year, what we're going to do is we're going to plant it so that we can then have more crops. Rather than calling that seed, let's call it money. And so a business, if they have money to run the business and they sell the product, or they take money and put it in their pocket as income, but they put some of it aside for the single purpose of creating a new job so that they can buy a new plant of equipment. Now, they didn't put it in their pocket, and they're using it to form what we call, if we just called it money, it'd be easier, but it has a special name. It's called capital. And we take money and we take capital and we lay it aside for the purpose of creating more jobs. Now, you don't want anybody to get in there. You don't want the rats to get in there and eat it. You don't want anybody to get that, because this is what creates the jobs. You certainly don't want politicians taxing it. And so in Asia, in all of the Asian tigers, Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Taiwan, all of these countries, the tax on capital, the capital gains tax is 0. In the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, the countries that were controlled under communism, when they got independence, they formed an economic system, and they said, we certainly don't want to tax the seed corn because that's how we create jobs. And so the tax on capital, the capital gains tax in Central and Eastern Europe is 0. In America, we have the highest capital gains tax in the world. We have the highest corporate tax in the world. And Barack Obama promises that by January 1st, he will double both. Now, when you do that, you don't create jobs, such that 1 person in 6 in America is now living in poverty, and you destroy wealth. You and I determine which direction the country goes economically. Secondly, militarily. Jerry mentioned that I knew Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was a fellow that after World War II, when the United States had engaged in this discussion with Russia, that is, they had nuclear weapons, we had nuclear weapons, and we had a defense policy called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. That is, you attack us, we attack you, we blow each other to kingdom come, therefore let's don't do that. They eventually developed rockets. And so we had airplanes and we had a security system. If a plane came, we could shoot down a plane. But when they developed these missiles that could hit America, we had nothing that could defend us. And Ronald Reagan, now 20 years later, when he becomes president, he says, if someone shoots a missile at America, what do we do about it? And the answer was, nothing. He said, that's not a good program. How about if we develop something that shoots down the missile before it hits us? And all of the common sense folks, Liberty Heritage Foundation, all these other think tanks, they said, that makes smart. Congressman said, oh no, we don't want to do that. Why? We don't know, we just don't want to do it. And so they made fun of it. They called it Star Wars. They said, besides, they said, you can't hit a missile with a missile anyway. And Ronald Reagan's response was, we're Americans. We can do this. And so they developed a system over time that said they practiced. And they developed a system where they could defend, they could hit a missile in the air. But in order to protect America, a missile would have to go outside the atmosphere. And so Congress passed a law that was in effect for over 12 years that said they couldn't even test a missile that would go out into the atmosphere, which meant what? It meant we developed this system. We gave it to Israel so Israel could defend against missile attack. We gave it to our friends in Europe so they could defend against missile attack. But America was still vulnerable until finally, when George W. Bush became president, he, along with the Congress, decided that we're going to put in a system that will defend America as well. A strategic defense initiative that Reagan had spoken about all those years earlier, we're finally going to do it. And in order to do it, as you know, you have to have a triangulation for GPS. You have to have latitude, longitude, and altitude. And so you had the satellite receptors in Alaska, you had them in the Pacific, and the third part of the triad was that the radars would be in the Czech Republic and the missiles would be in Poland. And when that would be completed in May of 2009, then if anyone sent a missile to America, we could shoot it down before it hit us. Most people think that would be a good thing to do. But we chose a new president in January of 2009, and the first thing that he did was cancel the agreement with the Czech Republic and with Poland to make sure that it didn't get completed. In America at this moment, if Iran or China sends a missile by accident or design to America, we are defenseless against it. And it so offended the Poles that Lech Wałęsa, who led the freedom charge against the Russians and got its nation's independent, became its first free president. When Barack Obama came to visit Poland, he refused to meet with him. And when Mitt Romney came about 6 weeks ago, he went, and instead of having a standard press conference like you do, say, this is a good man, we're welcome here, he said, for the sake of freedom, this man needs to be president of the United States. Our national defense, in order to defend on the field, you have to have an army. A friend, Admiral Thomas Moore, was a fellow that was in charge of the interrogation of the Japanese High Command at the end of World War II. He just died a few years ago. And I would engage him in conversation to learn as much as I could. I asked him one time, I said, how did the Japanese think they could attack us at Pearl Harbor and we wouldn't respond? He said, Bob, we asked everybody that, and they all gave us the same answer, which means they'd already agreed upon it, that they weren't just making it up. He said one of the things was that the United States had a draft, and it only passed the Congress by one vote, which showed a certain reluctance on our part. Number two is that we had gone through Army drills and exercises in Louisiana and Texas, and we used cardboard tanks and wooden guns. In other words, the United States had such a weak army that they knew they couldn't defend if they tried to. And they felt that if presented with a fait accompli, if they woke up one morning and found their navy was destroyed, they would have neither the will nor the capacity to respond. And so it invited aggression. And the day that they attacked, on December 7th, 1941, the United States Army was the 17th largest army in the world. It was smaller than Romania. And, of course, we know the consequences. As you saw the debate that took place just a week ago, under this president's plan, the United States Army, at the end of next year, will be smaller than it was in 1941, and the Navy will be smaller than any time since 1915. The strength of a nation is economic, a growing economy, military, and thirdly, it has to do with politics, the political system. Do people trust it? Do they have confidence in it? Or do they demonstrate in the street? At the end of World War I, there was a fight between the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim, all of the Middle East from Turkey on down through. The two of them were fighting against the rest of us. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was divided into a whole series of countries, and Jordan was formed. Palestine, or Israel, was formed, the British protectorate. Syria was formed. Iraq was formed. Saudi Arabia. And in Turkey, which had been the head of the Ottoman Empire, Ataturk, the new president, said, we're going to make our country like the rest of the world. We're not going to have women have to sit in the back and be covered up and do all these things. And so he outlawed the veil, he outlawed the fez, he outlawed the Cyrillic alphabet, began to dress in Western clothes, began to take the country into modernity. And this so offended some radical Muslims that in 1928 in Cairo, Egypt, they met for the purpose of reestablishing a Sharia law and a Muslim empire. And they called themselves the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, in order to do that, that meant that they had to do away with those other countries. Those countries that were now with Muslims leaders didn't want those radicals taken over, and so they have fought against the Muslim Brotherhood for all of these many, many years. Israel was attacked repeatedly by these folks, most certainly when they became a nation. 48, then in 1967, then again in 1973. Golda Meir in 1978 said to the new president of Egypt, he said, why don't we quit this? How about if our children and our grandchildren don't have to fight anymore? And the new president of Egypt, a fellow by the name of Anwar Sadat, said, I'm with you. Let's do it. And so when you sign an agreement, you need to go to some place that the whole world respects. So where would you go? Would you go to the United Nations? You go to America. And they went to the lawn of the White House, and they signed the peace accords between Egypt and Israel. And Anwar Sadat sealed his fate with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, in 1981, during a parade, they were marching by, and he's there with the leadership of the nation, and they stopped and sprayed all of the dignitaries that were there, killing President Anwar Sadat, killing a vast number of them. But the vice president, Hosni Mubarak, dove off the back of the grandstand and was injured, was winged as he was falling, but he was able to recover. He became president of Egypt and then did to the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood what they tried to do to him. And that has been basically the case in the interim period until 2009. And I would encourage you to go to the website, the White House website, YouTube, and find the very first speech that President Barack Obama gave on a foreign trip. He went to Cairo, Egypt, and he told Hosni Mubarak, our friend that made peace with Israel and been an ally, he said, you're not invited to my meeting. he invited the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood to sit in the front rows, in which he explained to them that the place where he had grown up, he had never been a Boy Scout or gone to Sunday school and done these. He listened to the call that was on at midnight or whatever it was, that was the sweetest sound on earth, and sent the message to these folks that no longer would America be in opposition. And now, these months later, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, throughout North Africa, every one of those countries are now headed by the Muslim Brotherhood for the very first time in history. 70% of the parliament in Egypt is Muslim Brotherhood, including the president and the vice president. If we continue on this road for another 4 years, it will be very, very dangerous for freedom, for Israel, for America, and for those that love freedom. Number 4, national defense, political, and finally would be leadership. A leader is a person who knows what needs to be done next, knows why it's important, and can bring together the resources necessary to accomplish the task, usually people. If a person is in a position of leadership, it doesn't make him a leader. You put a manager in a leadership position, he'll still be a manager. You put a leader in a manager's position, he'll still be a leader. A leader is a person who knows what needs to be done next and knows why. And in times of crisis, that's what we need. That's what George Washington recognized. Within a matter of days, this whole thing is going to stop unless someone begins to lead. In the 1930s, in the period just before World War II, Adolf Hitler sensed that he was a leader and that his opponents didn't have any. And so he began to test them. He moved into the demilitarized zone in violation of all the agreements just to see if anybody reacted, and nobody did. And so then he decided to go into Austria and see if anyone reacted, and no one did. And then he went in and took part of Czechoslovakia to see if anyone reacted, and no one did. All during this time, there's a fellow by the name of Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill is a leader. And lots of times people are jealous of leaders. And so in a parliamentary system, when you get together to form a new government, everybody agrees who's going to be the prime minister, who's going to be the finance minister, who's going to be the defense minister, and they all come to an agreement. And the first vote is who's going to be prime minister. But in the 1930s, in 3 governments, the first vote was not who's going to be prime minister. The first vote was this: let's make sure none of us put Winston Churchill any place in the cabinet. Because they knew no matter where he sat at the end of the table, he would overpower them. And so they literally locked him out of parliament, out of government. So he didn't even attend. He went down to Chartwell, sat there with his easel, and began to paint. They said within 36 inches of that easel was more power than all the houses of Westminster, because everybody knew that he knew what was going on. And people would come to visit him, and Hitler would attack him. Even though he held no position of responsibility, Hitler would attack him because he knew that Churchill understood what he was up to. But nobody listened. In 1938, finally, in September 1st, 1939, he marched into Poland, beginning of the Second World War. He then marched out throughout all of Europe, till finally it's April of 1940, and Europe is gone. And by this time, Britain is surrounded. And the king did something that hadn't been done in 400 years. He called in the prime minister, Neville Chamberlain, and said, "You know what we know, that you guys have been dead wrong for the last 10 years. So I will take the seals of power without an election." We're not going to have an election. We don't have time for that. We're going to take the seals of power and we're going to give them to Winston Churchill. And thank you very much, but don't let the door hit you. He then invited Winston Churchill to come in, and he gave him the authority to form a government. Churchill says as he left the Buckingham Palace, he felt the burdens of responsibility descend upon his shoulders. He said, but yet he felt that his entire life had been but a preparation for this hour. And then he said, for the first time, he went home and slept the sleep of a newborn babe, content in the knowledge that finally someone was in charge who knew what they were doing. But now, Hitler has taken over France, Holland, Belgium, formed an alliance with Italy, all of Europe, all of the great powers. What can Britain do against it? In fact, there's a book called 5 Days in London, in which it's now speculated that the reason the king decided to change government was that there was a provision to have a peace negotiation with Hitler by the British as to whether or not they would negotiate as to who would control the seas, and perhaps Britain would be allowed to keep its king or whatever. And so the whole world was sitting to see what is going to happen. This nation that is now crippled, it has refused to take a stand militarily. What is going to happen? And so Churchill went to Parliament to make his speech. Everybody in the world stopped. People in America, certainly people in Europe, certainly Hitler, certainly the British. Let me just give you a few words as to what this country faced. Remember, economically, it's the same as it was the day before. Militarily, it's the same as it was the day before. Politically, the political system has not changed. What has changed? Leadership. And so he said this to a waiting world. He said, the Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of all Christian civilization. Upon it depends our British life. The whole fury and might of the enemy must soon be turned upon us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us on this island or he will lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe will be freed and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. As for us, we shall not flag and we shall not fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and on the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight on the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. We will not fail. For if we do, the entire world, including the United States, including all that we have known, or all that we have cared for, will sink into an abyss of the dark ages. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth were to last for 1,000 years, that people will say historically that this was their finest hour. Well, in a time of crisis, we need leadership. In a time of crisis, the Chinese terms for crisis is danger and opportunity. That's where we are now. We are at a dynamite opportunity. The entire world is on its hinges that doesn't know where to go. The strongest economy in the world, the largest economy in the world is the United States of America. The strongest military in the world is the United States of America. The greatest political system in the history of man is the United States of America. You know what it needs? It needs a leader. It needs a leader that recognizes that this nation need not fear the future. We have, among other places, no one else can say this, America has the capacity at any given time to be energy independent. We are number one in natural gas. We are barely number two in coal. The Congress has prohibited the cataloging of how much oil we have on federal lands, because if anybody knew, then you'd say, well, why are we importing all this oil? Let me tell you what happened this week. In Ohio, in the eastern half of Ohio, they have now estimated between 8 and 9 billion barrels of oil. Now this isn't the Balkan up in North Dakota and South and all these other places. This is dumpy little southeast Ohio. We have we import a billion a year. We got 9 billion just in little southern Ohio. This nation could be energy independent whenever we have a leader that wants to be. Number two. Where do people want to invest? Where do people want to build? Where do people want to have a country, have a company? They want to have it in America. All over the world. Our tax policy has driven them away. We get a leader that wants to go to zero capital gains, and by the way, we have a candidate for president that wants to do that. We go to zero capital gains, we go to energy independence, this nation could take off like a rocket. Now, what's the prohibition? Only one. You and I have to make sure that we and every person we know shows up on election day and votes for those principles. Votes for free enterprise economically. Votes for a strong defense to make our friends in Israel and elsewhere secure. Votes for a political system that people believe in. Final thought. The chief lawyer for the ACLU was a person by the name of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Bill Clinton put her on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, she's Jewish. She's a refugee, a daughter of refugees who came to America because of our constitutional system that protect life. And yet Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to Cairo a few weeks ago and told the Muslim Brotherhood, if I were you, I would not look to America's Constitution as an example of how to draw up a new government. Let me tell you, we need people in the presidency that will appoint people to the judgeships that believe in the American Constitution. And that's the decision that you and I are going to make. And finally, we need people that know how to create jobs. We need people who know how to lead. And therefore, I'm going to pause and ask that we join together and ask for wisdom. Scripture says that righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. For blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Wisdom comes from, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God. That's what our founders did when they met in Philadelphia at the beginning of every day, and have done it till this time. On our, I call it a menu when we got married. My wife objects to that. It's called a program, I think, when you have the little program there. The Bible verse that we used when we got married was this: because of our faith, He has brought us into this place of highest privilege where we now stand. Yet we confidently and joyfully look forward to actually becoming all that He has had in mind for us to be. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we come into your presence because it has been made possible because of your Son, our Savior. We address you as Father, and we ask for your divine intervention, not only in our personal lives, but on behalf of our nation. We lift up this country that has honored you, and we ask that you would so imbue these citizens with your guidance that henceforth we will say, you are our guide. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. God bless.